Chairman Powell went back to the transitory term. And that is something, of course, everybody will remember because they said that inflation several years ago was just going to pass through and be transitory and then dissipate. Well, obviously, we know what happened, and we got significant amount of inflation. So that word caught everyone's attention, Brian, and we'll see if this time it actually is transitory.
That's right. I wonder if there was a collective groan among the press corps that was at the press conference when they heard him say that. And this was within the context of tariffs. So back in 2021, remember, we had the fiscal stimulus, the monetary stimulus, and also all the shutdowns as far as the supply chain issues. And that was just a formula for inflation. Yet he said, transitory, expect this to kind of resolve itself within 6 months. Well, so much for that, right? It lasted quite a bit longer, went quite a bit higher. This time, maybe he's going to be right about if there is inflation from tariffs, it is likely to be transitory. At least that's what their dot plot suggested when we looked at all the details in the statement that came out and then in their dot plot to show their guesses about what's going to happen to growth and inflation, downgraded the growth forecast saying it's going to be a little bit cooler. So there was that kind of that whiff or that aroma of stagflation there as far as slightly slower growth, slightly higher inflation. But he insisted that tariffs, just what they've seen in the past, is it results in a one-off increase in the price level, not a persistent increase in the rate of inflation.
So inflation is the rate of change. So if something goes up at 5%, and then slows down, it's still going up. If it goes down to their target of 2%, it's still, prices are still increasing at 2%. So rate of change, exactly right. The second part of that is we did see a lot of economists suggest that we'll have a little bit slower economy and a little bit higher inflation. That stagflation term certainly got a lot of people's attention. However, there was a lot of really good news that came out throughout the week. And of course, we saw some really good news with the Nvidia conference that was earlier in the week.
Yeah, I was really interested to watch that Nvidia conference. It used to be one of those things that I think only analysts would really watch, but now the general public seems to be tuning in for some of these just because Nvidia, this big chip maker who really is dominating artificial intelligence, the processors that are needed there, they were trying to show that they're pivoting a little bit more to how can they take this technology, these GPUs, and make it more useful and profitable for businesses to use. I think that oftentimes there's this view that if they just dominate that space, they're going to be, minting money off of it. But no, they recognize that for their continued competitive advantage, for sustainable profitability, that they need to also be very aware that their customers, the businesses that are going to be using these GPUs, they need to be able to do it in a profitable way. And so some of the things were really cool. Like there was this robot that they teamed up with Google. It was kind of adorable looking. It looked like something that you would have seen out of one of the Star Wars movies, where integrating the artificial intelligence with the robotics. And so some really interesting stuff there on the individual company side, but even on the macro side, bigger picture. The Atlanta Fed, you had highlighted a couple of weeks ago when they were projecting that we were going to have like this big drop in first quarter growth, that minus 2.4%. Well, the data as it's rolled in, they've had to revise that. Now it's up to a drop of 1.8% because we had pretty decent retail sales numbers and pretty decent industrial production numbers. And really that drop in growth, a lot of that was driven by something that isn't really part of GDP. Gold bars being imported from Switzerland. So based on our investment committee calculations that we did, the growth rate for the first quarter might come in at around like 1 to 1.2%, somewhere in there. A positive
number.
Exactly.
Right.
It no longer has that negative sign in front of it. And I think that's really what's important.
It is what's important because if there's going to be a recession, the market's going to react to that. And so if we see a positive number, and again, as you pointed out, all of these imports turned into production, and that'll move GDP up in Q2 or Q3, that'll be a positive sign, and the market will really like that. And lastly, I want to get to Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, did talk about, of course, retail sales, but there is a lot of stuff that he's talking about that is a positive environment.
It is. Yeah, Scott Bessent, I enjoy seeing him on CNBC because I think he has a great down-to-earth way of communicating what the policy plan really is. The media seems to just glom onto like one headline and then sometimes recycle that without getting into the details about what he's talking about. It's, for example, the idea of like detoxing the economy. is not saying that we're going to have a recession. It's talking about how for a few years, maybe longer, we seem to have become addicted to monetary stimulus and public sector spending, right? The fiscal spending, those stimulus checks and things like that. And he said, we need to wean the economy off of that dependency on the public sector and shift it to where it should be, which is more on the private sector. And I think he's been doing a pretty good job of going out there and trying to clarify that messaging.
And then lastly, Howard Lutnick and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, I think, are going to figure something out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they have a professional working relationship over the years. According to the new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, they had constructive talks, which I think is just a euphemism for saying that they're getting closer to coming to an agreement, right? They always use these kind of key words, and they're both very pragmatic. They don't want this to turn into like one of those slapping fights where it's like, oh, I'm going to slap you with tariffs, and I'm going to slap you back. It's more about, okay, what are the actual policy goals?
That's not what I was thinking when you said slapping fights, but that's okay.
Yeah, you can tell I'm a bit of a dork. So yeah.
No, have you seen those things? They're crazy. The slapping fights.
Now that you mentioned that, I saw this one where there was this. She looked like my grandmother, who is taking on somebody who looked like it could be, like an 18-year-old, and the grandma won.
Oh, I would think the grandma would win. That's Brian
Of course
Jacobsen.
she would. Of course.